Good evening. I'm Dick Clay. I'm president of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Gertrude Polk Brown Lecture Series. This lecture series was initiated in 1993 as a memorial to the life of Gertrude Polk Brown, and it's made possible by the continuous generous support of her family. Her daughter, Dace Brown Stubbs, her grandson, Garvin Brown IV, her daughter, Laura Lee Brown, and her grandchildren, Garvin Dieters, Laura Lee Gastus, and Polk Dieters. The series has brought internationally recognized historians to Louisville. More than 35,000 citizens have learned more about the significant stories of our region, nation, and world because of the Gertrude Polk Brown lectures. Now, tonight I am honored to introduce Caroline Fraser. Caroline is the editor of the Library of America edition of Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House books. And she's the author of Rewilding the World and God's Perfect Child. Her writing has appeared in the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, and the London Review of Books, among other publications. Tonight's lecture, Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018. Caroline holds a PhD in English from Harvard, as well as a master's, and her focus was contemporary American literature. Her undergraduate degree is from the University of California at Los Angeles. She is a permanent resident of Santa Fe, and I am absolutely thrilled, delighted to welcome Caroline to this lecture series tonight. Caroline?
Hi, good to see you all, even if I can't actually see you. But welcome, and thanks so much for joining us. And many thanks to Dick Clay and all the folks at the Filson Historical Society for arranging this. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing some photos and illustrations from my book, Prairie Fires, in a minute. Usually when I talk to an audience about Laura Ingalls Wilder, I ask for a show of hands of everybody who has read any of the books or seen the TV show, which of course you don't have to have done to join us right now. But what usually happens is that about half or possibly even as many as 3/4 of the people raise their hands, which just shows you, I think, how influential, how widespread the Little House universe has been. And we're going to talk about that a little more in a minute. But first, I thought I would tell you a little bit about the personal inspiration behind this book. And I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen with you. So my personal inspiration behind writing a biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder was really my own family, and that's who you're looking at right here. They were farmers, immigrants from Scandinavia. This is my grandmother's family, and here she is right in the middle of this photo, little Ruthie Larson. They were farming outside of Duluth, Minnesota around the turn of the century. And by the way, this doesn't even include the whole family. There were 16 kids in the family, and it was really hearing her stories, my grandmother's stories about this experience that in a lot of ways led to my interest in the Little House books, which I loved when I was a kid. I read them over and over. And it was clear from what she was telling me that their lives were so difficult. I mean, she often would talk about having to get up before dawn to help bake bread for the whole family, and having to take care of her younger siblings. So it was clear that her childhood was completely different from mine. In fact, I don't really think she had much of a childhood. She really just went to work as soon as she was 8 or 9. So I did feel a personal connection to the Little House books, which I think is quite common. And in fact, the books were taught so widely after their publication throughout the 1950s and 60s and so forth, that for generations of children, whether you had a personal connection or not, you may have gotten your sense of American frontier history from either the books or a little bit later, the TV show. And you may have come away with a kind of simplified idea that white settlement and homesteading were pretty much a success for the people involved, as Wilder had portrayed. And that idea, I think, has become very powerful in our culture. And that now leads us, I think, to questions about her material. Was homesteading a success for people like her father, Charles Ingalls? Were they able to hold on to their land? Did it benefit them? And if not, why did Laura want to believe that it did? And I think all of this goes back to the original idea behind what we call the American dream. I mean, we throw around that term quite loosely now. It just sort of has become a reference to fame or fortune or celebrity. But generations ago, for our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our ancestors, the idea was really about having your own land and being able to support your family on it. And yet that turned out to be almost impossible for many, many people, including the people you see here. Once the Larson family patriarch died, they ended up selling off the farm. And this was a real issue for the Wilders as well. So we're going to look at some images that show the difference between the truth about Wilder's life and the fiction that she made of it. The first group of images really shows the reality of her life, which was somewhat harsher than she depicted in books for children. And in some ways, I think it was even more dramatic. And so the first group is really about that truth. And then ultimately we'll get to some images toward the end about her fiction. So I think that Laura Ingalls' story really begins with this man. This is Little Crow, the leader of a band of Dakota Indians in Minnesota. He was the leader of this band, which went to war in 1862. It's now called the U.S. Dakota War. And it was really an unprecedented event, a surprise attack that he led that ended up killing around 600 white settlers. And now this happened 5 years before Laura Ingalls was born, but because her mother lived just across the Mississippi River from where this was happening, it caused, I think, the lifelong fears that she would have about Indians. And those fears, of course, would become the chief subject in many ways of Wilder's most famous novel, Little House on the Prairie. Just to give you an idea of where this was in relation to the Ingalls, here's a map of the war. This is the lower half of Minnesota, and you see this big red stripe. That was the Dakota Reservation. Down in the corner on the left, you'll see a place called Lake Shedick. Lake Shedick was the site of one of the massacres within the massacre, if you will. And a decade later, the Ingalls were going to live about 10 miles from Lake Shedick. And Laura would see the ruins, the foundations of homes that had been the homes of settlers before her, who had been killed. So this made a huge impression on her. And this is why this whole event, once called the Minnesota Massacre, comes up in Little House on the Prairie. And this is the kind of media coverage that the Minnesota Massacre received. This is from Harper's Illustrated Weekly, and in the foreground you see the bodies of settlers on the ground, and in the center, if you look back, you'll see a tree with a child impaled on a tree limb. There were all kinds of sensational accounts of what had happened in Minnesota. So it became a real source of fear and fascination for her as a child. So the kind of people who were displacing the Indians were people just like Laura Ingalls' parents, Charles and Caroline Ingalls. This is their wedding photo from 1860. When their daughters, their older daughters, Mary and Laura, were born, they were living near Pepin, Wisconsin, just, as I say, across the river from Minnesota. And they were going to spend quite a lot of time in covered wagons, as we can see in this Currier and Ives image. But the interesting thing to realize about the Ingalls travels as they moved about looking for a place to settle is that they never actually took a wagon train. They never took the Oregon Trail or the California Trail with other people. They never got that far west. Instead, their travels were confined largely to this northern tier of what we now call, Midwestern states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, brief part of their story in Iowa, Dakota Territory, with this very brief but important trip south to Kansas. And another thing about them is that they usually traveled alone. This is another view of Charles and Caroline. I love this photo because it really captures, I think, especially Charles' character. When Laura wrote about him later, she would always talk about his wild hair and his beard. And you can really see that here, as opposed to her mother, who looks very put together, kind of pious, which she was. That comb that you see in her hair was, we think, the one that the girls saved up their pennies to buy her at the drugstore. And these people were, very literate for farming folks. They cared about books and music, and so did their daughters. This is the famous image of the three elder Ingalls girls. It's the only image, in fact, that we have of them from their childhood. You see Carrie on the left, Mary seated in front, and Laura standing on the right. And it's notable how close their appearance is to their fictional descriptions in the Little House books. Carrie is a little bit frail looking. Mary, like her mother, also looks a bit pious, a very patient girl. And next to them, Laura really stands out as this very fierce and determined character, just sort of a completely different animal. But again, despite their very limited means and their poverty, they do look very well turned out. By contrast, here's another image of covered wagon folks that gives you a different sense of the time. These people look a little dirty, dispirited. This was a terribly difficult way to travel. Must have been very difficult to try to keep clean and your kids cared for. Here's another image that emphasizes, I think, the isolation of covered wagon people who were traveling this way. No roadside assistance, of course. You just had to rely on yourselves. And the Ingalls would have experienced this kind of isolation very often. And all the difficulties that went with it, accidents, illness, natural disasters were, of course, commonplace. The blizzards and prairie fires and floods that she writes about. And worst of all was the infamous locust invasion of the 1870s. This was a particularly horrific event. Just one of these swarms of locusts, and you can see the swarms in this, again, from Harper's Illustrated Weekly, descending upon a train, and people actually having to shovel the bodies of the insects off of the train. And just one of these swarms is estimated to have had 3.5 trillion insects in it. It stretched from the Great Plains all the way down to Texas and just wiped farmers out throughout a huge swath of the country, caused millions of dollars in damage, lost crops. And this was a pivotal event in the lives of the Ingalls. And I think it really illustrates the cost of settling lands that were marginal for farming. The Great Plains at that time, the kind of farming that was being practiced was what they called dry land farming without irrigation. And the precipitation was not to be relied on. But folks like Charles Ingalls just really didn't know that. Who did know it? The federal government, who had scientists and surveyors out there and knew that there were locust plagues and unreliable weather, and yet the railroads and the government together kept encouraging people to go out there. And so farmers really ended up going through the ringer. This is a kind of comic drawing of Mr. G. Hopper of Kansas, but there was really nothing funny about it. This is what farmers looked like, really, when the locusts were through with them. And the Ingalls were no exception. They ended up homeless. They trekked over to Iowa for a time, worked in a hotel, living hand to mouth. They lost a child at this time. Laura's little brother, Freddie, was born and died in less than a year. Wilder never chose to write anything about the Iowa period. She certainly described the grasshoppers. Everybody who has read her novels will remember that, but she did not want to acknowledge what it did to her family. And just to give you an idea of the kind of housing they were living in then, here is a photo of a tar paper shanty. This is actually Carrie Ingalls' tar paper shanty. She homesteaded in South Dakota in 1907. But if you just look at this structure, it's one single layer of boards wrapped in tar paper with little strips of lath to hold the tar paper on. Not much of a foundation. I don't think it was unknown for these things to actually blow away. And so this was a pretty difficult life. And this is what they were living in when they first moved to Dakota Territory, the Ingalls, in 1879. This is the bird's eye view of De Smet, the town where they moved. But when the Ingalls arrived, there was no town. The town had not yet been built. So they were living in a shanty near the railroad camp. And Charles Ingalls was working as a contractor. And they would survive what was called the long winter of 1880 to 81 in this town, in a building that Charles Ingalls built, which wasn't all that much better than a tar paper shanty. I think it did get a little cover from other buildings in the town, a little respite from the wind, but not much. And so that was a very difficult and almost deadly experience for the family. If you've never read any of the Little House books, I strongly recommend The Long Winter. It was one of my favorites when I was a kid. After that, Laura goes to high school in the town. This is one of her high school photos. I think she had ambitions to be a writer even then. You'll see in this photo, the little spit curls on her forehead, which her mother called a lunatic fringe. She's also wearing a nice pin at her throat from her beau, Almanzo Wilder, who had helped the town, saved the town during the long winter. But she, I think, was interested always in being a writer. She wrote poems. She wrote an essay in high school called Ambition that she saved for the rest of her life. But she didn't have a lot of opportunity to do anything about it at the time. She was engaged at 17 when this photo was taken, married at 18 to this handsome gentleman, Almanzo, and she has her first child at the age of 19. And this is her child, Rose. Not looking very happy. And in fact, Rose would have a pretty traumatic childhood. This is where they were living when Rose was born. This is the historical marker just north of De Smet for the Wilder homestead. And I'm not sure if you can see it, but at the very bottom of this marker, there's a quote from Laura that reads, "No one who has not pioneered can understand the fascination and the terror of it." And she had good reason to know the terror over the next few years, because they went through just a horrific series of catastrophes. They lost crops, they went into debt. The two of them, Laura and Almanzo, came down with diphtheria, very serious illness at that time. And as they were recovering, Almanzo suffered a stroke, which left him with what would be a permanent disability. He would struggle to use his hands and to walk for the rest of his life. The couple did have another baby the following year, a little boy who died less than a month after he was born. And then only a few weeks after that, their house burned down. So as you can see, this really kind of left them with no choice but to sell out, to try to pay off their debts, try to find somewhere else to live, someplace maybe that was warmer and would be kinder to Almanzo's condition. So she and Almanzo go off, they visit his parents for a while, they go to Florida. This is a kind of a goofy photo of the two of them in Florida. They hated it there, couldn't stand the heat. She really particularly disliked it. So they ended up coming back to De Smet for a while, working at odd jobs. And they finally decide to move sight unseen to a town called Mansfield in the Missouri Ozarks, which is advertised by the ever optimistic railroads as the land of the big red apples. And they're going to make this move in June of 1894. But right before they leave, they have one last photo taken of the Ingalls family. This is Ma seated on the left with Carrie behind her, Laura with her hand on her father's shoulder, and Grace standing behind Mary. And I think that this is a really important moment in their lives. The separation of Laura from her family, the nostalgia it caused, I think that is really the emotional core of the Little House books. It was helpful to me to think of Wilder's life as kind of three acts. And this moment, this very difficult separation from her family and her father, who she loved so much, is really the end of the first act of her life, because she will not see him again until he's on his deathbed in 1902. So the next act of their lives is going to be rebuilding from virtually nothing. And here they are doing just that. This is El Manzo in the buggy that took them 700 miles from De Smet to the town of Mansfield in southwest Missouri. They bought 40 acres, which they could barely afford, pretty scrubby land with some trees on it. And if you look on the right of this photo, you'll see a kind of primitive windowless log cabin. That's what they lived in for the first several years that they were there. And life was really tough for them when they went to Missouri. It was so difficult that they ended up eventually leasing their farm and moving into town where Rose could go to school. And here is Laura standing on the porch of that rented house in town, wearing her working apron. I think she was always a little bit embarrassed by this photo because she wrote on the back of it this quote from a hymn, "Just as I am without one plea." So the dream of the self-supporting farm really wasn't working out in Mansfield either. You know, she and El Manzo had to work at other jobs to support the farm, essentially. But they were able to save a little money during this period, and then they inherited some money from his father, which really helped out. Rose did go to school in Mansfield. This is her high school graduation photo. And she ended up almost immediately hopping on a train and going to Kansas City to be part of this new generation of women who were bachelor working girls working outside the home. And here she is in Kansas City, looking very happy and pleased with herself. And then her mother comes to visit her in Kansas City. And look at Laura now. She has really undergone a kind of transformation. She has, you know, if you think about her in the apron on her porch, now she's got a very glamorous hat. She's got a fur collar. She's all glammed up. And during this period, she is really transforming herself in a lot of ways. She's joining women's clubs and farm clubs. And this is really the first picture, I think, that shows her establishing a little bit of prosperity. By 1910, back home, the Wilders have gotten a little bit of a toehold on a better life with that inheritance. They're working on completing this beautiful farmhouse on their acreage. They call it Rocky Ridge. And the chimney is built out of stone collected from their own land. And a few years after this, Rose has moved to San Francisco, and she's married a fellow named Claire Gillette Lane, who is kind of a ne'er-do-well traveling salesman, exactly the kind of guy her parents warned her not to marry. But Laura has an opportunity to visit her there as well for the 1915 World's Fair. It was the Panama Pacific Exposition celebrating the rebirth of San Francisco after the earthquake. And this too is a pivotal moment for Laura and Rose because Rose is just starting to write for newspapers in San Francisco. And Laura sees this as a chance to apprentice herself to her daughter because she has gotten the idea from Rose that she could do some writing too. And she has a great time going to the exposition. She sees things like this statue, the pioneer woman with her children. This is still in Golden Gate Park. And I think she would have seen something like this. I mean, we know she saw it because she wrote home about it. But I think, you know, this really inspired her to realize that her history mattered, that she could write about her history. And this is the moment, again, when both women start writing for papers. Rose was not exactly writing, however, as a journalist. She was writing fiction, things that she'd made up, selling them as fact. This is something, a series she wrote called Ed Monroe Manhunter. And this, of course, is sort of the real fake news. But her mother took a much more respectable route, as you would expect. She began to write for a beloved Midwestern newspaper called the Missouri Ruralist. And if you look on this ad for the Ruralist, halfway down on the left, you'll see Mrs. A.J. Wilder listed as one of the columnists. And it was a real lucky break for her. This is a publicity photo that she had taken from the Ruralist. She'll end up writing for them for about 10 years. Meanwhile, Rose takes off. Her marriage doesn't last very long. She goes off to Europe. Here she is on a walking tour in France. But periodically, Rose is coming back to the farm in Missouri. She's earning money, but she's beginning to struggle emotionally. This is a photo that was taken shortly after she had shaved her head, sort of like Britney Spears or something. I mean, she began really struggling with depression around this time. And one of the outlandish things that she did was on her parents' farm was to invest a huge amount of money building her parents a new house, which I don't think they really wanted. This is Laura and Almanzo and a neighbor of theirs on the day that they moved in to this new house, which was built on their property outside of site of the farmhouse. This is really kind of the moment when Laura and Almanzo retire from farming at Rose's urging. Laura is in her early 60s. Here's another contemporary view of what was called the Rock House. It was a Sears kit house, so it should have been fairly economical, but Rose somehow managed to spend $11,000 on this house. She hired an architect, bought all kinds of furniture, made all kinds of changes to the design, and she moved into the old farmhouse. But this turns out to have been a spectacularly ill-timed investment because, of course, what's about to happen in 1929, the stock market crashes. The Dust Bowl is beginning. Rose loses all her money in the stock market, and the Wilders have kind of a front row seat on the Dust Bowl because all that dust that's blowing out in these big rollers from Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas is blowing into Missouri, which has horrific heat waves at this time. And in the face of this, having lost so much money, Rose has a nervous breakdown. Literally can't get out of bed for a time. So in the early 30s, this very difficult time for the country, Laura is, I think, once again, kind of forced back into a situation where she feels the responsibility to support the family. And that is the financial pressure, if you will, behind the writing of the books. And this brings us to her fiction. Originally, Laura's idea was to write her memoir. And she wrote her memoir on these big chief tablets from the dime store in pencil. The idea that she and Rose had was to try to sell this as a serial to a magazine in New York. But Rose shopped it around. It didn't sell. So ultimately, in a kind of act of desperation, Rose pulled a few quotations, some chunks out of her mother's manuscript, put them in the text for what she envisioned as a children's picture book. And she sent that to an editor in New York. And the editor liked it and said, you know, this is great, but I don't think it should be a picture book. I think it should be a longer book for older children. Can you write another 26,000 words? And so Laura sat down and wrote those words, and that becomes her first book, Little House in the Big Woods, published in 1932. And now if you think back to that photo of the tar paper shanty and look at the image on the cover of this book, this very cozy log cabin, the girls peeping out the door, the animals, the deer, the bear. You can see that her experience has been transformed into a kind of fairy tale. She's actually leaving out the harsher aspects of their lives, even in this very early story. In the manuscript that she left, you can actually see that she had written a description of herself crying as her favorite cow was led away to slaughter. That's not in this book. So that was the kind of thing that she was taking out. It's a beautifully illustrated edition. This is the color frontispiece from that book, Ma and Laura going to feed the cow in the paddock while Pa is away. Ma sees this animal in the paddock and gives it a big slap on the rump, and it turns out to be a bear. So again, you can see how fairy tale-like this has become. Here's another of my favorite images from that edition, the wolves howling outside the log cabin. And this book was a big success for a children's book published during the Depression. It sold quite well. But in the wake of that success, Rose does something quite fateful. She sees how well her mother's work is selling, and without telling Laura, she steals her material and writes a novel based on the Ingalls' lives. And here is that novel, Let the Hurricane Roar. And Laura finds out about this in the worst possible way. She sees an ad for it in Publishers Weekly. She learns that Rose has used the actual names of her parents, Charles and Caroline, and she was really just horrified by this. And it caused a very serious argument and really a rift between the women that lasts for years. And soon enough after this, Rose moves out of the farmhouse back to the East Coast. The minute she leaves the farmhouse, her parents move right back into it. And in some ways, I think the separation was probably good for them because for the next book they worked on, they were able to establish this kind of mother-daughter, writer-editor team. And so when they worked on this book, On the Banks of Plum Creek, you can really see them corresponding with each other through letters, debating how things should be handled. Because Rose was, as it turns out, a pretty savvy editor. And one of the things she encouraged her mother to do was to emphasize that these were true stories. This is why at the top of the cover of this book, you see it says the true story of an American pioneer family. And yet at the same time, it's leaving out some of these more squalid aspects that we've noted, you know, the poverty, the debt, the death of the little brother, Freddie. To promote this book, Laura took a trip. She and Almanzo drove up to Detroit, and she gave her famous book fair speech at Hudson's department store, one of the largest stores in the country. This is the little program from that book fair. And she gave a really wonderful description of her motivation for writing these books. I'm just going to read you a couple of sentences from this. She said, "I realized I had seen and lived it all the successive phases of the frontier. First the frontiersman, then the pioneer, then the farmers and the towns. I understood that in my own life, I represented a whole period of American history." And of course she did. But another thing she said in this talk, which she really embraced in years to come, was that everything in her books was all true, every detail. And that's an interesting and important claim because, of course, it wasn't true. You know, she had done quite a bit of fictionalizing. So I think what this shows us is that it's clear that Laura wanted to believe in this loving reinterpretation of her parents' lives. She kind of invents a success for them that they did not have. It was her homage, I think, to them. She wanted to believe her own fiction, and I think ultimately so do we. And a lot of my book, Prairie Fires, is about why we want to believe that fiction. Now, soon enough, she finishes the series. These are just a few images of the various versions, the original hardcovers, the yellow set that was available in paperback when I was growing up, the blue set, which came along a little later. Laura finishes the series in 1943. By this time, Rose is back east, living in Connecticut. She has become something of a political activist by this time. She's, here she is in this photo, testifying before Congress in 1939 against the US entry into World War II. Both Rose and Laura were very strongly opposed to the New Deal and to FDR. But Rose, I think, was far more outspoken in her beliefs and became, in this period, something of a gadfly. But her parents back in Missouri had a kind of lovely twilight period. Now, one of the most contented and comfortable phases of their lives. They're back in their farmhouse. They're getting lots of visitors. You can see fans, readers of the books. And they're financially secure, really for the first time in their lives. Almanzo dies in 1949. And while Laura was not in great health during the 1950s, I think that she was very contented. I think she really recognized, based on all this fan mail she was getting, that her readers really valued her and loved her. And she lives until 1957 and dies just a few days after her 90th birthday. But that, of course, is not the end of the story because of the incredible legacy that her work has had. In the period after her death, people were discovering the towns where her life and her work had taken place. So they were going to these little towns in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and a lot of the original buildings had not survived, and so towns took it upon themselves to recreate them. This is the recreation of the little house on the prairie south of Independence, Kansas. Here is what's called Laura's Living Prairie outside of De Smet, which was the property her father had owned. There are now lots of historical buildings that have been recreated on it. You can take a ride in a covered wagon. There's an RV park there. It's all quite extraordinary. But of course, the most famous fictional adaptation of Wilder's works was the TV show, which really emphasized, even more than Laura had herself, the success of the family. Michael Landon was the producer, the star, the writer, the director, and he apparently didn't like his TV children to look poor. So they always wore shoes. They had quite a nice house, quite palatial compared, I think, to the real thing. The original producer of the show, a man named Ed Friendly, was kind of dismayed about the way that Landon had made the show more about him than about Laura. And he said that it should have been called How Affluent Is My Prairie? And of course, Michael Landon had his own way of portraying Pa. So ultimately, I think the TV show, and it's fine if you're a fan of it, I don't have any objections to that, but I think it's really more about the 1970s than it is about the 1870s. One other note, the TV show was actually thanks to this man. This is Roger McBride. In her later years, Rose had adopted, and I use the term adopted quite loosely because he had a family, but Rose had met him when he was 14. He was the son of her editor at Reader's Digest. And he became her political acolyte, her manager, her lawyer. He never knew Laura. But when Rose died in 1968, she left her entire estate to him. And that, of course, by that time was worth a considerable amount of money. He was responsible for selling the rights to the TV show. And he's an interesting character. He had real political ambitions. He was in the Vermont State House for a while. And both he and Rose were fundamental in establishing the Libertarian Party in this country. He actually ran for president as a Libertarian in 1976. Another influence that he had on Wilder's legacy was that he caused to be written by various ghostwriters a whole lot of sequels to her work, including an entire series devoted to Rose. So all of this has led to lots of different kinds of adaptations of Wilder's work. There's a pageant that usually goes on every year in Walnut Grove. For example, every summer, well, not this summer, unfortunately, but they put on this kind of recreation of Laura's time in that town, complete with a recreation of a prairie fire, which I think is just amazing. Here's a statue of Laura carved in butter at the Iowa State Fair a couple of years ago. She has influenced fashion. These are prairie dresses that have been on sale and doing quite well, apparently, over the past few years. And I think since the start of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of people express interest in Wilder, all things Wilder, but especially this book, The Long Winter. And if you think about it, this book is very similar in some ways to what we're going through now. You know, people feeling trapped inside, as the Ingalls family was for months at a time, not being able to go out, and feeling very uncertain about the future. The kind of numbness that that brings about is described very vividly in The Long Winter. Laura herself, of course, did live through what was called the Spanish flu pandemic in 1919, and she actually wrote a little passage about this in The Ruralist. She said, the influenza epidemic has been particularly hard on farm folks, coming as it did just at the close of the season's work. We were really lonesome for some good times together, but being advised by the doctors not to gather in crowds, we have stayed at home as much as possible. Let's hope it hasn't become a habit. Indeed. And I think that that just shows her kind of trademark common sense. Finally, here is an image of the design for the American Library Association's Laura Ingalls Wilder Award. This was created in the 1950s. The first one was given to Wilder herself, designed by Garth Williams. Many of you have probably heard about the ALA changing the name of this award, but I show it to you because I think it's so interesting to see the design and realize that it's an illustration not of Wilder herself, the actual woman, but of Laura, the little girl, the fictional character, which again shows, I think, that we've always identified with the fiction and not as much with the reality. She used to sing this song called "Don't Leave the Farm, Boys," and it had a line in it that went, "There's gold in the farm if only you'll shovel it out." But for her, the gold was in books, not crops. And that is the story of Prairie Fires. So in conclusion, here are a few photo credits for you to look at. And I am going to back out of the screen share now and let Dick Clay come back in.
Hi, everybody. Amazing, wonderful. Thank you, Caroline. That is one of the best Gertrude Polk Browns I believe I've ever heard.
Thank you.
Thank you. And they're all of stellar quality. Here is a question from Emma Bryan, who is on the Filson staff and is our, I guess Emma has a bunch of hats, but she is best described as our community engagement coordinator. And she says, let's see, let me find it, because yes, in writing Prairie Fires, what did you learn that surprised you the most?
You know, I was aware of the difficulties in the relationship between Laura and her daughter, but what really surprised me was the fact that those continued really for their entire lives. They never really reached a point. And I kept looking for it. I kept looking for more of an explanation of why they had so many issues with each other, and looking for a moment when they kind of reconciled, I guess, because that often comes to people, you know, maybe later in their lives, but it often happens that, you know, people are able to kind of establish a kind of place where they're comfortable with each other and they forgive each other. And that just never happened for them, which I think is not only sad, but it's kind of ironic, because in Laura Ingalls Wilder, we have this, you know, amazing kind of premier example of somebody writing about a happy family, you know, the Ingalls family. And yet she was never able to achieve that in her own life. So that both surprised me and saddened me, I have to say.
Did Laura Ingalls Wilder converse, get to know any of the other female writers of her time. And I guess the example that I think of would be Willa Cather.
Yeah, it is fascinating to read Willa Cather alongside Laura Ingalls Wilder's work. But no, they did not meet. Laura was very much a homebody. She never, I think, went to New York City. She did visit her daughter on the East Coast once toward the end of her life, but I don't think she made it to the big city. And she doesn't seem to have had much of an opportunity to meet other writers. Now, she did meet some of Rose's friends. Rose had quite an acquaintance, and they would come out to the farmhouse to stay with her. So she did meet some of the more well-known magazine writers of the day, but not really names you would probably recognize now.
Here's another interesting question. I wonder if Rose would be diagnosed as having bipolar disorder.
A lot of people ask about that, and it's perfectly, makes perfect sense, because she did go through these very depressive phases, and then in her more kind of manic moments, she would spend a lot of money, which is kind of a very common thing, I think, in manic depressive illness. But it's hard to diagnose people, after the fact. And as a biographer, I think you have to be kind of careful not to push it too far. I mean, we certainly recognize aspects of her behavior that seem manic depressive, but she was never like somebody like Robert Lowell, the famous poet, who would go completely mad at certain points and think he was Napoleon or something. She never had that kind of illness.
Were the Ingalls and Wilder family experiences typical of people of the time, or were they more, I mean, were all of these folks particularly poverty-stricken?
I think earlier generations who had a shot at getting land in the what we now think of as the Midwest, really good land in Iowa or Minnesota or Ohio, those folks were much better off. But the people who came along a little bit later, like Charles Ingalls and Almanzo Wilder, they got pushed out onto the Great Plains because there was no good land left. And the Homestead Act came along so late. People had been agitating for that for decades, really for generations. People had wanted a Homestead Act, but the South, of course, was bitterly opposed to it. So it didn't happen. And so for people like Charles Ingalls, who didn't have money to buy land, they ended up with really very marginal properties that were subject to, hail and fire and it was almost impossible for them to make a go of it.
Here's a loaded, but I think interesting question. Do you have an opinion about the American Library Association's decision to remove Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from its most prestigious annual award for children's literature? I did not know that.
Yeah, I do. In fact, I wrote a piece about it for the Washington Post a couple of years ago when it happened. And I think my take on it is that when you look at what the librarians were dealing with and the constituencies that they felt that they had to serve, I think it became very clear to them that they really needed to make some kind of change. But at the time that they made the change, and it came about after, I think, many years of debate within the organization, and they had a vote on it, they did issue a statement in which they encouraged people to read the Little House books. You know, they were not trying to engage in an act of censorship, which I think is really important, you know, and so I understand why they did what they did. And I also have to say that, you know, as a writer and a researcher, librarians are just awesome. You know, I couldn't do what I do without them. They are an extraordinary professional league of people. And I think they knew what they were doing.
I happen to know quite a few librarians at the Filson, and I totally agree with you. This is a good one. This is from Christy, who's in Vermont right now. I was surprised the book focused more on Laura and Rosa's relationship than Laura and Almanzo's. Were they a happy couple?
Oh, I think Laura and Almanzo loved each other deeply. We don't know as much about their relationship because we don't have a lot of documents that give us a kind of view into the relationship. We know that he was, I think, a very sweet, funny man, said to be quite profane. And Laura, of course, always had a temper. He once said that he knew that when he married her, and he married her anyway. So I do think they loved each other. I think they did fight a certain amount, you know, over things on the farm and finances and stuff they didn't agree about. I sure do wish that we had more material that kind of unfolded his character a little bit more. But you just have to take what you can get.
This is from a historian who lives here in Louisville. How has the celebrity of the Little House books complicated Americans' understanding of Native people? And what do you think the responsibility of tourist attractions is with respect to balancing the picture? Or are there better ways to achieve this goal?
That's a very meaty question.
And it's Emily Bingham, and she has written an article that's been published in the Filson Journal on my old Kentucky home that goes into these questions. So it is, you know, when you think of a landmark house that supposedly portrays history, but maybe doesn't, how do you deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take the first part of the question first, you know, about the portrayal of American Indians in Wilder's work, which is largely in the Little House on the Prairie novel. And obviously that's a fascinating text now to study in terms of what it reveals about the ambiguity, you know, that people like Laura Ingalls Wilder felt toward Indians. She was, on the one hand, I think, like her mother, I think she was very fearful. I think she was also deeply fascinated by these people as a child and really wanted to know more about them. But I don't think saw anything of the you know, acquisitiveness of her father in essentially, you know, stealing land that belonged to the Osage and other materials to build the little house. You know, she I don't think had a kind of modern view about that. I think that the books offer older children now a real opportunity to delve into these issues, to delve into the history. I don't think that Little House on the Prairie can probably be read to, you know, uncritically to much younger audiences, much younger children, unless you're going to talk about all these these issues. You know, it's a book in which the phrase, "the only good Indian is a dead Indian," occurs several times. And so it's, you know, I think as we, you know, proceed in our kind of understanding of how Native Americans were treated and so forth, we really have to change the way we relate to the books, change the way we teach them, if we teach them at all. And as far as the tourist attractions, there are a lot of them, you know, dotted all over the country. They tend to be very impecunious in a way. You know, they don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of resources. You know, a year like this year is going to be extremely tough for these places. And so the view that they give tends to be a view that is very fan-friendly. It's not particularly historical. I have always wanted to see something more like they have in the UK, which is that national trust that, you know, brings a lot of these tourist places under you know, the kind of financial umbrella of the government. It gives them some support. And then they could probably make their approach and their educational materials maybe a little more nuanced. But until that happens, it's hard to see them kind of raising to another level.
This is from Kyle Brewer. Kyle heads up the Filson's IT and building management. From your research, did Laura or Rose ever express remorse in later years about portraying Laura's life in a better light than the truth?
No. That's pretty unequivocal.
Were they mercenary? Was Laura mercenary?
No, I don't really think I mean, I think she was thrilled to make some money. And I don't think she ever, in her wildest dreams, imagined that the books would make the money that they did or be as popular as they were. I think she was, you know, in that very crucial kind of 1930 period when she undertook to write her memoir, she was really just looking for a little, you know, just to make a little money because they had paid off, you know, she wanted to pay off their mortgage so that they didn't lose the farm. She needed a little money for living expenses, but she was not, I think, a mercenary creature. Now, toward the end of Rose's life, she, I think, becomes quite mercenary about the estate. And I do write a lot about that toward the end of the book.
And then we'll make this the last question. And there have been, heavens, so many others that are on the chat feature, and I hope I've asked most of them, but there'll be more, and we will see to it that you get a copy of this because just the sheer volume of questions is an extraordinary compliment to you. But here's this question. How important is it to understand that the Homestead Act was a government grant which challenges our idea of Western expansion as a pioneering spirit? Instead, was it a government-sponsored venture, and that this depended on the dispossession of indigenous peoples' lands as part of the settler colonial project? That's a big question, but
yeah, and that is absolutely getting at a lot of the truth behind the Homestead Act, which you know, is in some ways quite a remarkable act for its time, but clearly did not, and Abraham Lincoln did not see the effects that it would have on the Native peoples at all. So that was part of the tragedy of it. And it was certainly a federal handout. I mean, you could see it as one of the most extraordinary handouts of all time in our country because of the amount of money that was involved. On the other hand, when you look at the history behind it, that, you know, when Thomas Jefferson laid out all that cash for the Louisiana Purchase, he was using taxpayer money. And so a lot of citizens considered it their right to be able to get some of this land that they had helped to pay for. Now, they weren't thinking about, you know, indigenous rights at all, of course. And that, again, is part of the tragedy of this country. But that was the thinking behind it. It's a very kind of complex and sort of wonderful subject, though, to delve into. And that's a fascinating question.
And I'll end this lecture first by thanking everybody for participating. We have an amazing turnout, which doesn't surprise me in the least. But what I want to say is this. Years ago, when I was a teenage boy in Hopkinsville, I had 4 younger sisters, and my father one day said, I need your help. A kit had arrived, and the kit was a log cabin. And he and I put it together. To this day, I've never known why. I just assumed, you know, it wasn't any higher than my shoulders. And I assumed it, you know, it was for my sisters, but I didn't know why. And I've been texting back and forth with them as you've been speaking. And one of them said, "You dunce, didn't you know? It's because all of us were reading the Little House books." So anyway, this is, and then my wife was in here, and she just had to walk out the door, but she was saying, I read those books at least 4 times. This is, one, it's monumental scholarship. It's monumental Americana. It's monumental literature in an American way, and something to celebrate. And I loved the way that you took us through how we and our children and grandchildren can learn from it, but perhaps in different ways than Laura Ingalls Wilder intended. Caroline, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been delightful.
Goodbye, everybody.